And welcome to the August edition of the Conservation Outcomes webinar series. My name is Amy Overstreet, and I'm a Natural Resources Communications Specialist with the USDA Natural Resources Conservation Service Resource Inventory and Assessment Division. And it's really great to be here with you today. We host this webinar series to highlight activities across the Natural Resources Conservation Service, or NRCS, related to efforts to assess and quantify the impacts associated with NRCS conservation practices. These 1 hour live webinars occur on the fourth Thursday of even numbered months. We will get started with today's presentation in just a moment, but first, a few logistics for you. If you would like to receive email notifications with information on upcoming webinars, we hope that you'll subscribe to the NRCS Conservation Outcomes topic in GovDelivery. You can do that by following the instructions on the screen, and a direct link to subscribe, which is titled Subscribe for Conservation Outcomes Webinar GovDelivery Email Updates, is available on your screen under today's links. And you can also access those at the bottom left of your screen. As we mentioned earlier, today's webinar is being recorded and all participants joining are in listen-only mode, and all the audio is being broadcast through your device's speakers. If you have problems with the audio, sometimes computer or mobile device headsets can help with the audio quality and the volume. Please note that there is a closed captioning link provided in today's links box. You can click on that link to access live captioning, and the captions will open in a new browser window where you can follow along with the presenter's comments. We will also provide a transcript after the live event, along with the event recording. Please note that additional helpful links are available in the today's links box, including the slides from today's presentation, which are available for download in PDF format under the Today's Handouts section. If you would like to make the slide presentation pod larger, you can use the icon with the 4 corner arrows that appear in the upper right of the presentation box to turn on and off the full screen view. Finally, we encourage everyone to actively participate in today's webinar by typing questions or comments into the Q&A box that you will shortly see appearing on your screen. You can submit your questions and comments through today's presentation. We'll address as many of them as we can at the end of the event. With that, it's time to get started. I am now pleased to turn the microphone over to Dr. Louis Tupas, NRCS Deputy Chief for Soil Science and Resource Assessment Deputy Area.
Thank you, Amy. And I'd also like to give a big thanks to the team who makes these webinars possible. Good job, everyone. Hello and welcome to the latest installment of the NRCS Conservation Outcomes webinar series. As you know, NRCS has a long history of working with farmers and ranchers to help them conserve the natural heritage and sustainability of their operations. These recurring webinars gives us a way to communicate to our stakeholders the importance of voluntary conservation programs and the funding that is provided through the Farm Bill for these efforts. These webinars highlight some of the documented outcomes in terms of natural resource and economic benefits. For nearly 20 years, our Conservation Effects Assessment Program, or CEAP, has been documenting outcomes of our work on a variety of resource concerns. CEAP works closely with our science partners and other agencies and academia, and outcomes generated help inform improved conservation delivery across the agency. Today's webinar is very well timed with August as the National Water Quality Month. NRCS and the University of Maryland's Research and Education Center have a partnership to help improve accuracy in measuring conservation outcomes through CEAP. Today, our guest presenter, Dr. Ken Staver, will discuss how cover crops and reduced tillage practices impact nutrient and sediment losses from croplands and as a result impact water quality. So this is going to be an exciting one to present today. At this time, I'd like to turn it over to the NRCS soil scientist, Dr. Candice Williams, who works with the CEAP modeling team, to introduce Dr. Staver. Candice, on to you.
Thank you, Dr. Tupa. This afternoon, I have the pleasure of introducing Dr. Ken Staver, an associate research scientist at the WyeREC and Education Center with the University of Maryland College of Agriculture and Natural Resources, and one of our CEAP modeling collaborators. Dr. Staver has worked at WYE since 1984, conducting research on water, nutrient, energy, and carbon flows in coastal plains watersheds. The focus of his work has been on the development of strategies to minimize negative environmental impacts of agricultural activities while maintaining productivity and enhancing soil and water resources. He has been actively involved in varying roles as a technical advisor to the Maryland state agencies and the US EPA Chesapeake Bay program to bring research findings into the watershed management process. He is also an owner-operator of a grain farm in the headwaters of the Choptank River watershed, where he lives with his family. At this time, I would like to welcome our presenter, Dr. Ken Staver, to deliver his presentation on cover crop nitrogen and phosphorus dynamics. Dr. Staver.
It's great. It's great to be here. It's an honor to be in this venue. Thanks for that introduction, Dr. Williams. And now, if I can just see my first slide. Okay, let's try this again. Yeah. Okay, here we go. I have to say the technology help on this has been fantastic. So thank you very much. So what I'm going to try and do in this next 35 or 40 minutes is to talk a little bit first about a little bit of background on the Chesapeake Bay issue and Maryland agriculture, since this is a national audience. Usually I'm talking to a Chesapeake Bay community audience, so I don't always go through the background because everybody knows the background. But for you folks out there, first slide here is just where I'm coming from in the Chesapeake Bay. So you look in the right-hand part of this screen, we're talking about the Atlantic Ocean. Okay, and here's the Chesapeake Bay, and it drains most of Maryland, a good chunk of Virginia, a good chunk of Pennsylvania, all the way up into New York State, a little bit of Delaware, a little bit of West Virginia, and the District of Columbia too. So we're a highly populated area. But we also have this region on we call it Delmarva Peninsula, parts of the states of Maryland, Delaware, and Virginia. It's very rural. It stayed rural because there was no Bay Bridge. The crossing from the population centers wasn't, the first Bay Bridge first span wasn't put in until the 1950s. So it was really hard to get to this area. People went back and forth by ferry. So since the Bay Bridge was built, we've had development on the shore, what we call on the eastern shore of the bay. But overall, relative to lots of the coastal plain of the East Coast, this area has remained pretty rural and agricultural. If we zoom in a little bit, just try and give you a little background. Right here in the middle is the WyeREC and Education Center, this red dot. I look out my window behind me, I can see tidal waters. It's Wye River, subestuary Chesapeake Bay. It's got striped bass, oysters, and crabs are species of economic significance. Look out the other way and I see cornfields. So this is primarily a research center focused on grain production, some horticultural programs too. If we look along the water, a lot of the waterfront since the Bay Bridge has been put in has been developed. Everybody wants to live by the water, so all the waterfront close to the Bay Bridge, which connects everybody to sort of the higher paying jobs in this region, there's been a lot of pressure for development. When we get to the interior of the shore, we look at these areas. It actually looks like a little snapshot of the Midwest. Lots of dominated by row crop agriculture. The area has a long history. Lots of this land's been in production literally for centuries. But the recent look at a slide here of some NASS data of the history of ag production. This is for the state of Maryland. So if some of you out in the Midwest are probably maybe chuckling at these acres, we're talking about hundreds of thousands of planted acres here. This is the whole state of Maryland. This isn't a county or anything, but we're a small state. But the interesting thing about this is, in terms of where we are now in production, we kind of mimic the whole country. So early on, a century ago, we had wheat production for human food, corn production for livestock feed. As the interstate transport network was built and the West opened up, we're really not the best wheat growing area from a climate standpoint. So the wheat has tailed off. No surprise, hay production's trailed off, but soy, the big change in the last half century has been the increase of soy production. So now we roughly have corn and soybean acres, and this is really mimics the national situation where corn and soybean acres are pretty similar, and then we have wheat at about down here at about 30% of that. So we're a small state off here in the east, but we do have a row crop situation that mimics that is similar to the whole country. So if we first thing to talk about when we talk about rotations, this is just a picture I took in June of our wheat field that had just been harvested. The straw stockpiled for use in mushroom production in southern Pennsylvania. So we talk about cover crops. We're always talking about what our cover crop windows are, and a lot of in some areas of wheat production, there's a fairly long window for cover crop planting after wheat. For us, we're far enough south. Same straw stack just earlier this week that we plant soybeans after wheat harvest. So when I'm talking about our cover crop windows here, we're primarily looking at after wheat or after soybean and corn harvest. In this case, these double crop beans, we call them after wheat, they won't be harvested till early November generally, or even later. So we don't have a lot of our long windows here, even after wheat harvest. So I think for everybody, that's something you always have to keep at the front of your mind. I mean, we have all these cover crop options, but your first thing you really have to think about is what are your primary crops and what are your windows for planting. So on the Chesapeake Bay issue, I mean, the main problem in the Bay, basically, and this was pretty much nailed down in the early 80s. So this is not a recent finding. This is a finding that's decades old. We have excessive nutrient inputs, too much algae growth. So we get low oxygen levels. Just today, we got our monthly sort of dead zone report for Chesapeake Bay comes out. It comes out monthly in the summer. I know there's dead zones also in the Gulf of Mexico that make the national news. So these result from excess algae production that when they decay, they drop down in the water column and consume all the oxygen. We also have large shallow areas in the bay that historically were covered with rooted vascular plant communities that got their nutrients out of the sediment, not out of the water column. So these are incredibly important places for juvenile fish, for hatchery areas, for water quality, for overwintering waterfowl. So these are really important part of the ecosystem. When the nutrient levels start to increase, it shifted the advantage to the algae in the water column. So the algae could use the water column nutrients. They competed for light and basically shaded out the rooted vascular plant community. So big goal of restoration is to reduce the low oxygen levels and also restore the rooted the grass beds. So the restoration strategy, which started in the late 80s, agreements were signed by all the states. Again, it was a lot of states we have involved to reduce the nutrient inputs by about 40%. We've had lots of updates. And in 2010, because the goals weren't really being achieved, the federal government stepped in and imposed a TMDL. That's a total maximum daily load. It basically establishes maximum nutrient inputs that are allowed. So full implementation of this has to be done by 2025. So this doesn't mean that the loads actually have to be reduced by 2025. It's just that all the things have to be in place on the land by 2025 to eventually reach those goals. So right now we're in an all hands on deck mode of trying to get things on the ground to meet the TMDL by 2025. So the nitrogen problem on the land, we do not have a highly tiled landscape. We have a very, very limited amount of tiling done compared to lots of parts of the country. So our natural groundwater, our shallow aquifers under cropland are highly enriched in nitrate N and results in high nitrate levels in stream flow and we end up with, and that's what really drives our loading rates of algal available N to tidal waters. So nitrate, not unlike total N, nitrate is totally available for algae when it hits tidal waters. So this is just a monitoring site in the Delmarva Peninsula. So on this nitrate in this stream, when it's in base flow mode, that's when it's primarily groundwater driven, running 4 to 5 milligrams per liter. But otherwise, the water quality is pretty good. This particular site in the spring, they stock it with trout to put and take trout fishing. I mean, trout kind of like clean water. So overall, until the water temperatures get too warm, this water is totally suitable for trout, but it just carries a lot of nitrate that when it discharges into tidal waters, it drives algae growth. So we do sites. We have multiple sites, a couple watersheds really side by side that we at the center that we've done surface runoff monitoring, overall total monitoring, but specifically surface runoff monitoring for since the early 80s. I think we're north of 10,000 samples, individual samples we've analyzed out of these fields. And this is what gets this is where you always do your tour stops. This is what gets the press when somebody sees surface runoff. But really the story for our watersheds in terms of nitrogen is the subsurface side of the story. So it's not always what you see. And just some rough numbers. So in the coastal plain where we are, and even throughout the whole Bay watershed, it's surprising how much of the nitrate, how much of the total end load from cropland ends up moving through subsurface. But for the coastal plain, we're looking at roughly 80%. So if we look at the bottom, having kilograms per hectare here and English units too, and they're really not that different. But overall, on average, like 20 to 30 kilograms per hectare of nitrate N from cropland gets delivered to tidal water through subsurface flow, 18 to 27 pounds per acre. So, and I'm probably not telling you folks anything you don't know. It all starts in the root zone. So when we're trying to manage the groundwater quality, stream water quality, we're really our management point is the root zone. So for us, if we're going to get those end loads down, we're going to have to reduce the nitrate leaching rates, which eventually will lead to lower groundwater and stream nitrate concentrations. And one tool we have, and that's really what this talk is about, is winter cereal cover crops do this very well. So, and this is an old slide, and I just keep using this slide because the point, we've known this for a long time. I would say to you, you can go, I'd encourage anybody, find an old copy, 1938 Yearbook of Agriculture, Soils and Men, and look at William Albrecht's chapter on soil organic matter. And there's a graph that looks kind of like this. So this is corn production. We're putting on 140 pounds of N, growing 160 bushels of corn. So this is, for us, this is fantastic nutrient management. We can't do much better than this in terms of how much corn we're producing for the amount of N we're applying. It's been in continuous corn production for 10 years at this point. So we're looking at soil nitrate in the top foot, 0 to 6 and 6 to 12. And we often hear about how inefficient corn is at using soil N. But really, corn is very good at taking up N. And in this case, we're looking at the N levels when the corn is fully done its thing. There's almost no nitrate left in the top foot. The corn has taken up all of it. But what's happening here is, as we move into later in the fall, the corn is done taking up nitrate in our area. It's dry in the dry down mode. We're headed towards harvest season. And once the corn stops taking up nitrate, the soil organic matter is being continued to be used by soil microbes. And as they use that organic matter, they're releasing ammonia, which converts to nitrate. So our nitrate levels start to accumulate. So these nitrate levels we see in the fall, we come back and this is about 20 kilograms per hectare we end up with. This is not about unused fertilizer, but this is about the natural process of mineralization of soil organic matter without any plant uptake there to utilize it. And we just look at some soil temperature data. It's really easy to see why this happens. For us, our corn maturity date is late August, right about now. It's about 85 degrees outside. No surprise, our soil temperatures are still up in the 70s. So as long as your soil temperatures are up anywhere up above 50 degrees, you're going to have soil microbial processes are going to be chugging along, chewing up organic matter and releasing nitrate. And if we talk about, we're talking about climate change a lot these days and temperature. And just a point here, so this is the solid, look at the solid lines. This is monthly total heat units. So this is base 40. So we use base 40 for winter cereals. So this is basically the average, the high and the low temperature for a day divided by 2 minus 40. So that's how you get heat units. Growing degree days, heat units, sort of an interchangeable term. So this is what we get per month where we are here at the center. And the thing, if you look at the last few years, the solid line, the solid symbols, that's the 5-year trailing average. We don't know. I mean, we'll know someday whether this is just a short-term blip. But I think all indications are we're headed up, especially in the fall and the spring. So here we are. We have, since we've started here, we have about 10% more, 10% more heat units in September and October than we did back in the 80s. And I think all indications are this is going to continue. So from a standpoint of that mineralization process, it's probably going to increase. It's going to be an issue we're going to have to deal with. Wintertime, we don't see so much difference, but in the spring and the fall, we're seeing warmer soils. So what about soybeans? That's half our acres. Remember, we have as many soybeans as much soybean acre as we do have corn acre, and we don't apply N. So we really don't even have a nutrient management strategy to reduce our N losses from soybeans. So here's another old slide. This is soybeans. We're looking at the growing season, 0 to 1 foot soil nitrate. So early in the season, before the pods start to fill, soybeans don't take up so much soil nitrate. So we have the weeds have been killed or the ground's been tilled. There's not much uptake capacity, so nitrate accumulates here in the summer. But as soon as those beans go into pod fill mode, we see the soil nitrate get used very, very quickly and pretty efficiently as the beans get made. I mean, that's where all the N is in soybeans at the end of the season. It's in those beans. So it's from an energetic standpoint for a soybean, it's more efficient to use soil nitrate than to fix atmospheric N. So as long as there's nitrate available, they use it. And then they go and they fix it and they add more by fixation. But again, once the beans are done, once the beans are filled and they go into dry down mode, year after year, this is a whole bunch of different years, we see this fall creep of nitrate back up where we end up with 20 pounds per acre of nitrate N in the top foot. The red line at the bottom, this is after wheat beans or double crop beans. So they senesce later. So they're growing longer. So the longer the summer crop grows, the later it is before the nitrate levels start to build up again. So I think a general misconception is that there's a lot of, we certainly want to do the best we can with nutrient management, but a lot of the times we're thinking about just about fertilizer N, but I think it's a misconception that nitrate in the root zone at the end of this growing season is just unused residual fertilizer N. And this is just a soybean field that had rye planted after harvest in late October. So anytime we're looking at a field in the winter that's green, that N that's in that biomass is nitrate that had been in the root zone, vulnerable to leaching. So here we have that nitrate tied up. This is, I think, in the picture is worth 1,000 words. The nitrate is tied up in plant biomass, doing all kinds of good things for us and not available for leaching. And there's a bottom line slide. I'm not going to go through leachate and soil nitrate tests and soil cores to show how cover crops work. But this is looking at groundwater in 2 fields here at the center where we've monitored groundwater continuously since the early 80s. First, if we look at the left-hand part of the graph, and we've done a lot of groundwater sampling and soil coring off the site, off the center here. If we look in private fields, we tend to see shallow groundwater in the 10 to 20 milligram per liter range. So I'm over in here. Okay. This is just not university experiment station type numbers. These are the numbers we see all over Delmarva when we sample, and sometimes even higher. We started using cover crops in the late 80s. We're using rye. Somebody say, why are you using rye? We did a lot of testing. Early on, looking at different cereals. Rye came out ahead. I heard a talk recently where the speaker said, rye's boring, but the bottom line is it's probably the best for reducing nitrate losses. And I think that's the conclusion we came to early on. We just started planting rye right after corn grain harvest. And over a decade for us, this is a matter of scrubbing the nitrate. So we're not taking nitrate out of the deep profile. We're not taking nitrate out of shallow groundwater. All we're doing is starting to put cleaner water into the system. So slowly over 10 years, we're going to cut our nitrate concentrations in groundwater in half or even by 2 or even more. So this for us is a bottom line slide basically showing what we can do. Same amount of N inputs, maintaining yields, in some cases even increasing yields, and you're just using winter cereals and keeping the nitrate up in the production system. So in Maryland, We have a program now statewide, pretty generous incentive for farmers. I think we have the highest. Obviously, we're a small state, so we don't have the most acres of cover crops, but we do. I think we're well out in number one in terms of the percentage of acres of our cropland that are actually get cover crops in the winter. I think one of the greatest successes of this, in addition to just reducing the end losses from cropland, is it's given farmers a chance to really play around with cover crops, figure out all the logistics of using cover crops, how to do it for the least amount possible, how to fit it into their management system and labor and machinery and time, all those sorts of things without having that financial risk. Because the one thing with cover crops is you have costs up front, you have time requirements in a busy time of the season, and the very earliest you're going to get a return on your investment is the next harvest. So it's a pretty big risk for farmers up front. At the Bay level, this is a cover page from our current guidance for the Bay watershed model, which is the tracking system for meeting the TMDL. So this is our overall. We have a Bay watershed model that does all the accounting basically to see whether or not we're on track to meet the TMDL. This has efficient coefficients for over 100 different cover crop options having to do with the species, the timing, the planting method in terms of the reductions you can expect to achieve with cover crops. One thing I would, for all of you, and I know again you're all around the country and all different growing conditions and crops, and you have to really look at your available heat units. And then here I have growing degree days on this graph. So even in the Chesapeake Bay watershed, so we're just talking in one watershed here. The top line here is Richmond, Virginia, which is a southern part of the watershed. Down at the bottom here, we're up in upstate New York. We're talking for an October 1st planting date in Richmond, you're going to go way up over 1,000 heat units. Up in the upper part of the watershed, October 1st, you're already hard pressed to get to 500. So you move a little later in the fall, the northern parts of the watershed, there's very few heat units available for cover crops. Whereas in the lower part, we can move into early November, mid-November, and still have adequate heat units to produce a pretty decent fall cover crop. So wherever you are, you really have to look at this part of your situation to figure out your best cover crop options. And then back to this heat unit slide, just sort of a point that's, I know this nail's been hit every time somebody gives a cover crop, they talk about this, but when we look at the months, we're talking heat units, and when you go from September to October, you pretty much cut them in half, and you go from October to November, you cut them in half again. You go from November to December, you cut them in half again. So really planning a lot, getting to really pushing to get cover crops established during the fall is crucial, because you're really the heat unit availability really tails off fast as you get later in the season. So I think to wrap up the old part of the story, I would say that the Chesapeake cover crop nitrogen story, and when we have the subsurface end loss, it's the main way nitrates. It's the main rate total nitrogen is getting to the Bay from cropland. Winter cereal cover crops for us are essential for achieving end loss reduction goals. In the post-harvest period, falling corn and soybeans, which is our big acreages. If you're going to do watershed restoration, you pretty much have to address the large acreages. It's great to do really good things in small spaces, but if you're going to meet overall goals, you have to cover a lot of the landscape. Heat unit availability determines cover crop options and effectiveness. Early planting is almost always better. And again, at the bottom, and I think we all know this is School of Hard Knocks, implementation is the challenge, and that's the hardest thing. So now we move on to the next part of the cover crop story. So soil health, this left part of this is a cover page off from the Soil Health Institute, put out a report looking at cover crop adoption nationally based on NASS data. To find my arrow here it is over here. So the two big practices are no-till and cover crops. Here in Maryland, like as I said earlier, we're probably, I know we are number one in terms of percent of land covered with cover crops. I think we're in the top one. We're second or third in no-till. We're a high early. We started no-till back in the 80s, pretty active, and now there's hardly any soybeans planted in Maryland that aren't no-till. But on the right-hand side here, we have it's a trend graph from a USGS website. It's actually in the resources. You can check in the resources associated with this webinar. And it basically has trends in stream nitrate data at some of their, or stream water quality data at their long-term monitoring sites. So over here where we are, so here's Chesapeake Bay, right here in the middle. So our research center is over around here. In Central Delmarva, they have a couple long-term sites. And in this case, we're talking about phosphorus. So we're an area that we use no-till. We use a lot of cover crops. So we're coming out really high on our soil health and soil quality standard. But for TP, this is for TP, we're looking at our short-term trends are in the wrong direction. So the red arrows up are degrading from a standpoint of total phosphorus. So I guess it's not all perfect. I guess that's always the story. I grabbed this slide off the internet. This is Lake Erie off the Toledo, when the Toledo water supply issue was hitting. Probably some of you are might be in your home territory. So this is primarily a phosphorus issue. For us, the focus has been mostly on nitrogen because coastal waters, algal limitation is primarily nitrogen limited. We're dealing with phosphorus too, but I know in freshwater systems, we're really talking about the phosphorus issue and worried about anyway, we're losing algal available phosphorus. So that's part of the cover crop story too. I guess it falls under the category that everything affects everything. So again, back to our watersheds. So one thing you notice in this slide, this is about 2-inch rain in a half an hour, and you can see where the corn is. So this would be late July. So if you just look at the water coming out of here, again, picture worth 1,000 words. This is no-till, cover crops, grass waterways. We have almost no erosion out of our systems. I would say overall, we have naturally low erosion rates. And when we do these practices, we virtually have soil loss rates in the hundreds. We talk about hundreds of pounds, not in tons. So we don't lose much erosion, which is overall a great thing. But from a phosphorus standpoint, it's not quite that clear. I have to mention manure here. Of course, our grain, what happens to our grain? Grain gets fed to livestock. In our case, our livestock are poultry. So all the poultry, all the corn, soybeans on Delmarva mostly go into poultry production. The manure goes back on cropland. We had a long-term study looking at all the different options, no-till, conventional till. There's almost no conventional till left, but we did do incorporation, full incorporation, vertical tillage. And then we had the early prototype of the USDA subsurfer, I think it was called, that we actually injected poultry litter in a no-till setting. So we looked at all those options, and the bottom line, and I'm just going to show just to make a point here. This is surface runoff, monthly, average monthly surface runoff phosphorus concentrations. All right, and we're looking across the whole year by month. So we're in corn grain production. In this particular graph, we have 2 tillage options. In one case, we do full incorporation of the manure. In the other case, it's just no-till. All right, and we're using poultry manure for the primary end source. No surprise, we know poultry manure has high available soluble N and P. If we look at phosphorus in the months right after application, we're looking at 4 and 5 milligram per liter phosphorus concentrations. The other thing about this graph to note is the dotted line, the hollow symbols, that's dissolved P. So the solid is total. So the difference between the solid and the hollow here is the particulate P. So basically, almost all the phosphorus lost out of the no-till system is dissolved P. And even in our tilled system, we have a little bit more particulate P loss, but again, dissolved P is dominating our systems. So in our systems, we end up losing, when we put a soluble P source on the surface, we end up with high P losses in runoff. And that's an issue of the interaction of manure application and tillage. So easy, pretty clear-cut case, very intuitive. Now, this is probably the more interesting slide from the standpoint of thinking about cover crops, the role of cover crops. So this is corn for grain, planted into winter rye. We have inorganic end source, and no phosphorus is applied at all. So this is a 5-year period, continuous corn, no P. We had adequate P levels for optimum grain production, according to our agronomic recommendations here. So no-till, the green. We always put no-till in green because green is always the good color, right? And so again, so no P applied. Where are our peaks? Our peaks in phosphorus loss are in the spring after we till. No surprise there in a tilled system. But in no-till, we see a little spring hit after we kill all the weed growth and the cover crop in the field. And then again in the fall, and the big dissolved P spike is after corn grain harvest. That's when the corn vegetation senesces and the phosphorus comes out of the corn residue. So this is not a microbial process like mineralization. This is actually phosphate leaching out of the dead corn tissue. So this is sort of a tip-off that we really need to think about the vegetation part of the role the cover crops might play in phosphorus dynamics. So if we look at something like this, this is corn being no-tilled into a killed rye cover crop. I'd say this is a fairly idyllic looking situation, great for soil erosion, great for carbon, great for weed control, good for nitrogen for sure. On phosphorus, not so clear for us. So I'd say the bottom line, if we talk about reduced tillage or even going to no-till, it's not always a phosphorus fix. I think continuous no-till leads to soil P stratification, and we're going to have higher soluble P near the soil surface. Anything we do, whether it's putting on manure or we're just anything we add to the soil surface that increases the availability of soluble P, it increases the potential for dissolved P losses in storm flow. So in lower erosion settings like we have, if we actually can increase dissolved P to the point that we offset the reductions we get in particulate P losses when tillage is reduced or limited. So our total P losses, I know in many places people say, well, we reduced our total P, but we increased our dissolved P. For us, we actually increased our dissolved P and increase our total P losses in a no-till versus a tilled setting. So on the bottom one, and this is really about the cover crop part of it, as soil P miners, that's all plants mine soil P. That is, they take it out of the soil and move it up into above ground vegetation. Cover crops play some role that we need to be mindful of. So we started a project in our current project with NRCS and in support of the CEAP modeling effort, looking at a bunch of different cover crop issues, nitrogen availability in the root zone, phosphorus availability in the root zone, the timing of kill down. So a whole bunch of cover crop parameters trying to get a better handle on the overall impact. And I think just from a standpoint of us starting with nitrogen, where this issue has gone now. So in December 2020, and many of you probably get the conservation news briefs, and we really were excited to see this, that basically the federal, there's going to be a federal role to pay farmers to plant cover crops, in this case, to offset greenhouse gas emissions from agriculture. So this isn't about water quality, but from our standpoint, if we have cover crops out on the landscape, we're going to have all these benefits. So anyway, the bottom line here is, so we're not just talking about water quality and nitrogen, now we're talking about phosphorus, and now we have the climate change part. So we're talking about all these impacts of cover crops. And the climate change one is going to get to be a bigger and bigger one in terms of the cover crop discussion. So we've been looking at sort of soil moisture impacts, the whole temperature situation as the temperatures change. And also a big one is, so as we, if you're in areas with lots of livestock, you know, you have many places have very high soil P levels. And we have the same thing here where we have long-term history of poultry manure as an end source. We have high soil P, which affects the phosphorus levels in plant tissue. So for us, we looked at different phosphorus application rates to simulate different soil P statuses, and then took the biomass and put it out and looked at the leachate coming through the biomass. In this case, this is just we get samples when we get natural rainfall. So we're not doing a lab study. This is actually, it gets put out like this, gets covered up with spun row covers. And we just, every time it rains, we get the samples and look at the leachate that we get out of the cover crop residue. Also, we've looked at the early fly-on dates. There's been a big push for the winter kill, the cover crops that winter kill, like the radishes. After corn harvest for us, after corn grain harvest, it's basically too late to plant the radishes. So we also included some aerial seeding as part of this. So this is just putting radishes on our watersheds. If you look at what it looks like, so here's the combine. If you know what you're looking at here, this is the combine coming through the corn. Here you can see the radishes. Combine's coming through. The little radishes are coming up already. So they're already got a head start before grain harvest. I think one thing for us, you know, it's always very apparent after corn grain harvest, we aren't short on residue. So we have plenty of residue there. So the cover crop really isn't that important for us for residue in the fall. It gets a little bit more important. Well, actually, just a slide here early on. So this is late fall for us, radishes after the corn's been harvested. For us, what's wrong with these radishes? They just run out of nitrogen. This is the way radishes look for us with our nutrient management systems. So we don't really get those radishes that you see in pictures that are as big as your arm or your leg even. You see monster radishes. They're really neat pictures, but I would say if you're getting radishes that look like that, you better look back at your nitrogen management plan, because for us, we just don't get those kinds of radishes in our corn grain systems with nutrient management plans in place. So these radishes are just they haven't been hit with cold weather. They're just out of N. So here's where we get in late February or early February in this case. So what you're looking at here is dead radishes. This is a winter-killed cover crop. It has appealed to farmers because they don't have to worry about the cover crop in the spring. But from a water quality standpoint, there's concerns that we go into what for us is a very active hydrologic period. This is runoff in late winter, which is very common. I think March is our highest volume of surface runoff. If we don't have a cover crop residue out there, we just don't have the soil protected. We don't have the nutrients tied up like we do with winter cereals. So that's another thing we've been looking at in this study. Also looking at taking off the forage. So just harvested. We have a beef operation here. We can use the silage. So we've done a couple years on the watersheds of just taking the corn off the silage and looking at the surface runoff phosphorus losses. And then finally, the spring kill part. Lots of interest in delayed spring kill to get more carbon in the system. For us, we're also interested in the adding a few more weeks of suppressed nitrate levels in the soil. We can still leach nitrate late in the spring, so the longer we keep that cover crop growing, the less likely we'll lose nitrate in the spring. Just a quick slide here on above. So this is above ground dry matter in, and the point of this slide is that for the most point for us, cereal cover crops planted early in the fall after corn harvest, they can take up more nitrate than is generally available. Okay, so these are some different N statuses. We have a low N status here. So basically by December 1st, this lower, here we go, get a hold of this rascal again. Okay, it's in the lower case. There's nothing wrong here. This is just out of N. There's nothing else to take up. So this cover crop is like those yellow radishes. It's done. We have a higher N status situation. The cover crop can take it up. And then here we have an extreme case. This was a summer fallow field, so we just kept the weeds suppressed. So there's tons of nitrate there because the microbes have been chomping away all summer and nothing's taking it up. So we have a huge nitrate load. The winter cereals respond very aggressively to high nitrate. So the point here is we can take up more N generally. In well-managed systems, we have extra capability to take up nitrate if we plant the cover crop early. I think in the spring side, there's a bunch of lines here, but the one to really focus on here is the green, the line down at the bottom. We got two lines that really be interested in here. This top line, so this is an early kill date. So we kill this cover crop here in mid-March. So again, nothing taking up nitrate. The soil temperature starting to warm up. As soon as the soil temperature starts to warm up, this is soil pore water nitrate. So this is actually not ppms of nitrate on a soil basis. This is pore water concentrations. We see those pore water concentrations starting to shoot up. As soon as it starts to warm up, got the microbes kicking in, release the nitrate, up we go. If we keep that cover crop there for another month, got to grab my arrow here again. So this bottom line, as long as that rides there, any nitrate, so it's not that the nitrate's not being released. As it's released, it's taken up immediately. So we kill the cover crop here, then the nitrate starts to recover. And the good news here from a production standpoint is when we get out in here into June, it's not like there's no nitrate where we let the cover crop grow. It's delayed, but it catches up fast. So the point is here, we can do spring management to keep the nitrate levels down. So I'd say cover crops, I just think of them as they're a climate change firewall. They can take up more nitrate in the fall than they usually do if we get them planted early, and they also can help in the spring. So we really can use cover crops to counteract the negative soil and water impacts due to increased soil organic matter breakdown as the soil warms. Then just a little bit take a quick look here at some of the phosphorus data from the leaching out of the cover crop residues, because I think this is probably one of the more interesting things. So this is looking at rye tissue phosphorus levels My arrow, my arrow always goes to a different, someplace I can't find it. Okay. So this is rye tissue phosphorus content. So this is the actual phosphorus concentration in the rye biomass as a function of phosphorus that was applied in the fall. So for all dates, and then the different lines are different dates. For all the dates, even putting on a relatively small amount of phosphorus, here in the case 50 kilograms per hectare, we see a big jump in the tissue P. Okay, so this is 2016. The phosphorus was applied. We were trying to mimic soil P levels. So we get this big response in tissue P as a function of the available phosphorus in the root zone. Okay. Now, so if we go on to cumulative rye leachate phosphorus, all right, so this is looking at what comes out of that tissue. And no big surprise here, when we kill the cover crop in the spring and look at the leachate coming out, our top line is our high P treatment and our low line is our no P treatment. So we're getting double or triple. There it is again. It hides in amongst the symbols. We're getting double or triple the phosphorus coming out of the rye tissue. And this is normalized on an area basis. So this isn't like we have more biomass. We just have on a per biomass basis, we get double to triple the amount of phosphorus coming out of the cover crop tissue in the spring as a result of available P in the fall. So we look a year later, it's not just about applying the fertilizer P. This is a year later where we've done it again without adding any more phosphorus. Same sort of thing. Here we have double, even triple the amount of P coming out of the cover crop. So clearly, when the P levels are high in the soil, the tissue levels are going to be higher, and phosphorus that's in tissue that's killed is going to come out of that tissue. That's just how things work. Now, I would say keep things in perspective. Phosphorus in cover crops, we're talking 10 to 20 pounds per acre. We talk about manure applications, we're looking at 100 pounds per acre of phosphorus. So this is not I don't want anybody to sort of have the take-home message be that cover crops are our phosphorus problem. It's just we have to be mindful that they aren't going to solve all the problems. And in some things, they really do a fantastic job. In other things, we have to sort of really be careful of our overall management system. So I think the old cover crop basics to wrap up here: mineralization of organic N, key contributor to high nitrate leaching losses from summer annual crops. Heat unit availability determines your cover crop options. So wherever you are, you have to sort of sort all that out and figure out what's going to work for you. Early establishment is critical, but better than late than never. I mean, if you get half the uptake, that's better than no uptake. And lots of times in the spring, you get some benefits. So you don't just quit if you can't get early. Winter cereals, they're just the most reliable for reducing nitrate leaching following corn and soybeans. And I would say, rye is the best, generally the best of the best. Boring, but it works. And early planted winter cereal crops generally are unlimited, and they have the capacity to offset increasing fall mineralization and effects of winter-spring precipitation increases. So, and then finally, just some challenges. Increasing temperatures are likely to lengthen active mineralization period, leading to the loss of soil C and increased nitrate leaching. I think that's where we're headed. Cover crop phosphorus mining, it adds to the no-till stratification problem just because it brings a little bit more phosphorus to the soil surface. It's not a dominant thing, but it is a contributing thing. Spring cover crop growth can be used to suppress nitrate leaching potential and to add carbon to the soil, but more residue may contribute to higher dissolved P losses, with soil P as a factor in determining residue P. And this last phrase is really important. So we really have to be mindful of our 4 R's approaches where we manage the whole system so that we are keeping everything where it needs to be to reduce nutrient losses. And with that, I am finished, and thank you very much. And I guess I'm open for questions.
Thank you, Dr. Staver, for your informative presentation. At this time, we welcome questions from the chat. Dr. Staver, have you evaluated cover crops other than rye and radishes? And what is your opinion on cover crop mixes?
Well, of course, there's lots of work being done on mixes now. I would say back in the early 80s, or late 80s and 90s, we had some folks here in Maryland. We're doing a lot of work with mixes. A guy named Morris Decker, and Jack Weisinger at Beltsville, and they had some students. Andy Clark, and Paul Shipley, and they were working with vetch, primarily with vetch, some with crimson clover and rye mixes. And, we like the idea of a mix because you sort of get the best of everything. So we were working with them early on. There was work being done here early on at the center and around Maryland. It was great work. And I think the bottom line was you sort of, on the mixed part with the legumes, you're looking for the end benefit, and the economics pretty much drive that for a farmer. It's not a cover crop benefit. It's not a water quality benefit. It's more of an economic benefit for the farmer. For us, the focus has been on the water quality part and reducing the nitrate leaching. So I think it goes back to the comment I made that, I was quoting somebody, I wish I could remember who said it, about rye being boring. But for us being focused on nitrate leaching, rye is really, and with the planting windows we have, where we're always fighting the late harvests and the short windows. Rye gets the most nitrate uptake sort of in in short windows, cool conditions. So sort of that race, I think rye works the best. So if you have other objectives, the mixes, the mixes can work, but I think for our windows here, I guess I would go back to saying that people have to look at the windows they have and their objectives. But if you're really after nitrate control, the winter cereals are hard to beat, and rye is sort of the top of the top.
Thank you. We have another question in the chat. Dr. Staver, are you familiar with any cover studies being done in the Southwest region of the U.S. at high elevations where water isn't so abundant?
Well, I can't say I'm familiar with the Southwestern literature, just to be totally honest, but I know the issue of water availability has always circled around cover crops, because the last thing you want to do is bring water stress to your crop that you're growing to pay the bills. It's a tricky topic. The key is if you can get the cover crop residue there for cover, it can save, it can conserve moisture, and it can really work to conserve moisture. But timing of when you kill a cover crop for us is the critical part in managing moisture availability. So I think it's sort of a localized thing I just can't speak to the situation in the details of the Southwest, but it is a matter of, usually there's a way to get some benefit, but it's really tied to the active period of cover crop growth versus the active versus the water replenishment cycle. But it is one to be very careful of in a water limited environment, because cover crops can take up some water. So I wish I could be more helpful, but I can't go too far with an answer for that area.
Thank you. What would you say are the biggest misconceptions about cover crops?
The biggest misconceptions, all cover crops. Let's see. Wow, that's a big topic. I think the misconception and this is sort of spanning 30 years of dealing with this. When we first started in Maryland, everybody was worried about the spring part of cover crops, like they were going to get away from you and create this, impossible planting situation in the spring. And, 30 years ago, the planters weren't what they were, and we didn't have sort of the understanding of herbicides and nutrients. So herbicide, sort of control. So I think early on, I would say decades ago, the misconception was the cover crops were a spring nightmare for management. I think that was a misconception, which I think is for us here in Maryland, since we have so much experience, very, very many of our farmers are pretty familiar with how you manage cover crops in the spring, and they're not fearful of cover crops sort of taking over, in the spring. Now, as we move forward now, I think the other misconception is probably, again, I'm going to stick with winter cereals, that they're going to hurt you on the nitrogen side. And I think it has to do with how you manage it. It's a management issue. I think there's a lot of folks that think they're going to have nitrogen issues. They're going to have nitrogen deficiency with cover crops, which can happen with winter cereals if the management isn't sort of spot on. It requires more management, but it's very doable. So I guess those are the two I would say. I didn't speak to all the misconceptions about other cover crops, so that's such a big topic. But on winter cereals, I would say the spring management is a nightmare, is a misconception. Is going to be a nightmare, is a misconception, and I think that it's going to hurt you on nitrogen is a misconception, but it can. So I guess that's a pretty fuzzy answer, but that's my answer.
All right, we have time for one last question. This one comes from the chat. When is the best stage to kill rye in spring for maximum nitrate retentions? So a little bit depends on the following crop. So there's all these sort of local management details that you have to take in. So you have to be careful with hard and fast rules. It makes me a little leery about talking to a national audience, because everybody has their local situation with their soils and their rainfall patterns. Do they have irrigation or don't they? What crop are they planting afterwards? So all those things have to be in the equation. But in general, especially now that we have these planters that do so well in handling residue, we even have people now that don't kill their cover crops until after they plant. They call it planting green, is a big thing, which is really taking it to a whole nother level. But, the longer you have something growing there, the longer the nitrate is suppressed. So if your key goal is to suppress nitrate loss, then you're going to let it grow. You want to just have that window between when the cover crop stops taking up nitrate and your main crop starts taking up nitrate. You want that window as small as possible. So as late as you can manage it is fine. So in soybeans, it's easier because you don't have to worry about nitrate competition. Okay. Corn, it's a little trickier because when the nitrate is super, super low in the soil, you're going to have to make sure you have enough nitrogen there for the corn if you plant, if you really kill the cover crop right at the very end. So again, there's a lot of details there, but basically the bottom line on nitrate is having something growing there is going to keep the nitrate levels low. And as soon as you kill it, if the temperatures are warm, the nitrate levels will start to pop up again. So, but you have to obviously balance, your cropping situation and what you're trying to do from a production standpoint. So you don't want to. The one thing we really try to stay away from with recommendations is having farmers have a negative outcome, because if they do something that they look at their corn or whatever crop they have and say, "Oh, that cover crop really hurt me," you are going to have a long, hard slog getting them to try cover crops again. So I'd say if you're encouraging farmers to use cover crops, make sure they start off with a very conservative approach that's going to have a minimal chance of impacting their main crop for production. So.
All right, we're at the top of the hour. I just want to thank you so much to Dr. Williams for inviting Dr. Staver to be our guest presenter today. And Dr. Staver, we really appreciate you sharing your excellent presentation and insights with us. And thank you to Dr. Tupas for your opening comments. And I'd also like to recognize my NRCS communication partner, Elizabeth Creech, for her technical support today. We're going to post the recording of the webinar on our NRCS Conservation Outcomes webpage, and you can find that link in today's links in the box below. We also have recordings of past webinars on that webpage and details on how to subscribe to the GovDelivery emails that we mentioned at the beginning of the session. We hope to see you again for future Conservation Outcomes webinars. Have a great afternoon, everyone. Thank you.